Snow creaked beneath the boots as a flashlight swept the frozen tree line, stopping on something that did not belong, a shape pressed into winter silence, preserved by cold, waiting for names, measurements, and photographs, waiting for the long work of truth to begin before dawn arrived and sealed the moment. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on December 27, 1994, outside the small Maine town of Millbrook, a place defined by narrow roads, pine forests, and winters that closed in early and stayed late. The woman found that morning was later identified as Emily Rose Caldwell, 22 years old, a community college student home for the holidays. Her name would appear in local newspapers before the year ended, printed beneath a school portrait that showed an ordinary smile frozen in time. The temperature that morning never climbed above 20 degrees, and the cold preserved more than the ground. It preserved questions that would take decades to answer. Emily Caldwell had been reported missing on Christmas Eve. Her mother told police she had left the house in the early evening, saying she needed air and intended to drive the familiar back roads to clear her head. Snow had begun falling lightly, the kind that softens sound and shortens visibility without warning. When Emily did not return by midnight, concern became procedure. Officers documented the clothing last seen, the vehicle description, and the route she usually took. Flyers were printed before New Year's Day, taped to grocery store windows and gas station doors, their edges curling from cold. The initial search followed protocol. Patrol cars traced county roads. Volunteers walked wooded shoulders with gloved hands and flashlights. The weather complicated everything. Tire tracks disappeared overnight, footprints filled with fresh snow. By the time Emily was found 3 days after Christmas, the environment had already altered the scene. Investigators treated the location carefully, noting the position of her car several hundred yards away, partially concealed by trees, keys still in the ignition, fuel nearly empty. There were no signs of a collision. The vehicle was impounded and processed for trace evidence under fluorescent lights at the county garage. The autopsy was conducted at the state medical examiner's office in Augusta. The report was cautious and technical, noting hypothermia as a contributing factor and evidence of prior physical trauma consistent with restraint. There was no sensational language, only measurements, times, and probabilities. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Samples were taken and catalogued, including hair, fibers, and biological material, then sealed and logged into evidence storage that smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust. In 1994, DNA technology existed, but its limits were well known. What could be tested then might say more later. Millbrook responded the way small towns do. Church bells rang for Emily's funeral just before New Year's Eve. The local paper ran a timeline reconstructed from interviews, placing her last confirmed sighting at a convenience store at 6:42 p.m., captured on grainy security footage. The image showed her bundled in a winter coat, buying coffee and windshield fluid. Outside, Christmas lights still hung from lampposts, blinking against the dark. Investigators focused first on proximity. Friends, former boyfriends, coworkers from her part-time job at a bookstore were interviewed in municipal offices warmed by space heaters. Alibis were checked against work schedules and phone records. No one stood out. The case files grew heavier as weeks passed. By February, snowbanks lined the roads higher than mailboxes, and leads thinned. The case moved from active to pending, a quiet administrative change that felt heavier than words. Years passed. Thanksgiving came and went. Christmas lights were taken down and put back up. Emily's parents moved from the house she never returned to, but her name stayed in the file index. Periodic reviews were conducted. Evidence boxes were opened, inventories confirmed, then resealed. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic science prompted a re-examination of biological samples. A partial DNA profile was developed but matched no one in state or federal databases. It was entered anyway, waiting. The town changed slowly. A new courthouse annex was built. Officers retired. Younger detectives inherited older cases. Emily Caldwell's file was among them, its edges yellowed, its photographs still stark. In 2018, a state cold case unit began systematically reviewing unsolved homicides from the 1990s. Emily's case met criteria. The victim was young. The crime scene suggested interaction. Evidence still existed. The review began with the basics. The original timeline was rebuilt using digitized records. Weather reports were reanalyzed. Vehicle data was reconsidered. The distance between Emily's car and where she was found suggested she had left the vehicle intentionally or been compelled to do so. A detail overlooked in 1994 gained new weight. A witness had reported a dark pickup truck parked along the road that evening, engine running, hazard lights off. At the time, it had seemed unremarkable. The cold case team requested familial DNA comparison, a method unavailable decades earlier. The partial profile was uploaded again, this time flagged for potential relatives. Months passed without result. Then, in late November, just before Thanksgiving 2021, a notification arrived. A distant match appeared in another state, connected to a man who had once lived seasonally in Maine during the mid-1990s, working construction and leaving few records behind. Investigators traced the name through employment logs and old rental agreements. The man, Thomas Andrew Harlan, had been 31 in 1994. He owned a dark pickup truck registered that year. He had been arrested twice for assault in other states, charges later reduced. His name did not appear in Emily's original file. He had left Maine in early 1995. Surveillance and background checks were conducted quietly. Court orders were obtained. In December, as towns prepared for Christmas again, investigators collected discarded items from Harlan's residence. The DNA comparison was conclusive. The probability statistics filled pages. There was no ambiguity. Harlan was arrested on December 14, 2022. The news broke the following morning, framed by headlines that referenced a winter long past. Emily Caldwell's parents were notified first. The arraignment was procedural and brief. The evidence presentation would come later, laid out methodically, connecting a dark road, a cold night, preserved samples, and a technology that finally caught up. Millbrook absorbed the news with a familiar quiet. Snow fell again. Lights appeared in windows. At the edge of town, the place where Emily was found remained unmarked, just trees and winter ground. The case was no longer open. The work at last had an ending. By the time the arrest became public, nearly 3 decades had passed since the winter Emily Caldwell disappeared, and the case record had grown into a layered archive of paper, microfilm, and digital files. Investigators approached the renewed phase with restraint, aware that time altered memories but not documents. The focus shifted from discovery to verification, ensuring every step met evidentiary standards shaped by modern scrutiny and older law. Thomas Andrew Harlan was transported to Maine under a lawful extradition order. The process unfolded without spectacle. Court filings referenced the original 1994 incident number, linking past and present with bureaucratic precision. The arrest affidavit outlined the DNA match probability, the historical vehicle registration, and employment records placing Harlan within 10 miles of the discovery site during the Christmas week of 1994. Each element was cross-referenced against contemporaneous police logs. Forensic analysts revisited the original evidence with care. The biological samples collected during Emily Caldwell's autopsy had been stored under controlled conditions. their integrity confirmed through chain of custody records signed by technicians long retired. Advances in amplification allowed for a full genetic profile, eliminating uncertainties present in the partial analysis conducted years earlier. Independent labs replicated the findings, an added safeguard against procedural challenge. Investigators also re-examined the vehicle evidence. Photographs from the impound lot showed fibers collected from Emily's car seats and floor mats. At the time, the fibers were inconclusive. In 2022, comparative analysis linked them to upholstery material consistent with the interior of Harlan's pickup truck model, manufactured during the early 1990s. The match was not singular proof, but it reinforced the larger evidentiary framework. Witness statements from 1994 were revisited. Audio recordings preserved on cassette were digitized, revealing tonal nuances absent from typed summaries. One account described a truck idling near the roadside that night, its silhouette partially obscured by snowfall. Another noted unfamiliar tire tracks near the tree line days later, an observation discounted originally due to the volume of winter traffic. Context changed its relevance. The prosecution reconstructed the timeline with methodical clarity. On Christmas Eve, Emily Caldwell left her family home shortly before dusk. Security footage placed her at the convenience store minutes later. Fuel records showed her vehicle had enough gas for extended driving, contradicting the empty tank found days later. Investigators theorized prolonged idling or forced movement, consistent with the eventual scene layout. Cellular technology offered little from 1994, but landline records showed no outgoing calls from Emily after she left home. Harlan's phone records from that period were sparse, but toll logs placed him in nearby towns earlier that afternoon. Payroll stubs from a construction site indicated he was not scheduled to work Christmas Eve, aligning with opportunity. As winter returned to Maine in 2023, pretrial hearings began. Defense motions challenged the age of the evidence and the reliability of witness recollection. The court evaluated each claim against documented preservation and corroboration. Judges emphasized that time alone did not negate admissibility when procedural integrity remained intact. The rulings favored inclusion, narrowing the defense strategy. Media coverage remained measured. Local newspapers framed the case as a study in persistence rather than shock. Articles referenced Emily Caldwell's age, her academic plans, and the holidays she never returned from. Photographs of snow-lined roads accompanied text, reinforcing the seasonal weight carried since the original crime. National attention remained limited, reflecting the quiet nature of the community involved. During jury selection, potential jurors were screened for prior knowledge. Many remembered the missing person flyers from decades earlier, faded memories resurfacing with the trial announcement. The court sought impartiality, selecting individuals willing to separate recollection from evidence presented anew. The process took days, unfolding under fluorescent lights and winter coats hung on wooden racks. The prosecution's case emphasized sequence and restraint. Experts explained forensic methods without embellishment, guiding jurors through probability statistics and preservation techniques. Maps illustrated distances between the vehicle location and the recovery site. Weather data demonstrated how snowfall patterns could obscure movement, reinforcing why the crime evaded resolution for so long. The defense focused on reasonable doubt, highlighting gaps inherent in cold cases. They acknowledged the DNA match while questioning context. The court allowed these arguments, recognizing the adversarial balance required for lawful resolution. The jury listened, notebooks filling with dates, names, and measurements. Throughout proceedings, Emily Caldwell's family attended quietly. No statements were made during testimony. Their presence was noted but not emphasized, consistent with courtroom decorum. The trial extended into early December, the season mirroring the original timeline. Outside, holiday decorations appeared along courthouse steps, an unintentional contrast to the subject matter inside. As deliberations began, the case distilled into its core components. A young woman vanished during a winter evening. Evidence preserved beyond expectation identified a man present, capable, and linked by biology and circumstance. Jurors weighed the cumulative strength rather than any single element, following instructions delivered with precision. The verdict was reached after 2 days. The foreperson handed the document forward, its language formal and unadorned. Thomas Andrew Harlan was found guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, accounting for the severity of the offense and absence of mitigating factors. A term of life imprisonment with parole eligibility after decades was imposed. The courtroom emptied slowly. Snow fell again outside, light and steady. For Millbrook, the case shifted from question to record, filed under solved. The holidays approached with familiar routines, but one absence remained acknowledged at last. In the months following sentencing, the case entered a quieter phase defined by paperwork rather than patrols. Appeals were filed as a matter of course, focused on evidentiary age and the statistical presentation of genetic probability. Appellate briefs cited precedent from state and federal courts, arguing that jurors might overvalue scientific certainty. The reviewing court examined transcripts line by line, comparing instruction language to approved standards. The conviction was affirmed without modification, the opinion noting careful adherence to protocol and the absence of prejudicial error. With the legal outcome stabilized, investigators completed administrative closure. Evidence inventories were updated, with items designated for long-term retention. Digital copies of records were archived in redundant systems, while physical files were boxed and labeled with dates that span generations. The process was meticulous, reflecting lessons learned from decades of storage and retrieval. Nothing was discarded without authorization. The case number was marked resolved in statewide databases. For the Caldwell family, the conclusion arrived in measured increments. Victim notification services provided written summaries of the proceedings and explained post-conviction timelines. Restitution hearings were deemed unnecessary given the nature of the offense. The family requested privacy and declined public statements. Their choice was respected by local media, which reduced coverage to brief updates during appellate review. The restraint matched the tone that had characterized the investigation's final years. Community response in Millbrook was subdued. There were no vigils or rallies, only quiet conversations in places where news traveled slowly. Older residents recalled the winter of 1994 with clarity sharpened by time, describing roads narrower then, plows less frequent, and the way darkness seemed to arrive earlier. Younger residents learned the details through articles that emphasized process over drama. The case became a reference point in discussions about evidence preservation and patience. Law enforcement agencies used the outcome as a training example. Seminars highlighted the importance of chain of custody documentation, particularly for biological material collected before modern methods existed. Instructors emphasized that restraint at a scene, even when resources were limited, could extend the life of evidence. The Emily Caldwell case was presented without photographs, relying instead on timelines and laboratory reports to illustrate principles. The Cold Case Unit conducted an internal review, assessing what might have been done differently in 1994 and what could not have been known. They concluded that early investigative steps had been consistent with standards of the time. The primary limitation had been technological, not procedural. This finding offered a measure of professional closure for retired officers who had once worked the case and carried its weight through their careers. In December of the following year, nearly 30 years after Emily Caldwell's disappearance, the town entered another holiday season. Store windows displayed familiar decorations. Snow accumulated along sidewalks in uneven ridges. The place where the vehicle had been found remained unchanged, a turnout along a secondary road with no marker. The decision not to install one reflected the family's wishes and the community's preference for quiet remembrance. Local schools incorporated the case into civics discussions, focusing on the justice system's capacity for delayed accountability. Teachers avoided sensational details, instead outlining how laws, laboratories, and databases evolved. Students learned that resolution did not always arrive swiftly, but that persistence could yield lawful outcomes. The lesson was framed as institutional rather than personal. At the state level, funding for cold case work increased modestly. Legislators cited successful resolutions as justification, referencing the Caldwell case among others. Grants supported digitization projects and interagency collaboration. The policy shift was incremental, but tangible, reflecting a recognition that unresolved cases carried long-term costs. Thomas Andrew Harlan was transferred to a correctional facility within the state, his intake records noting age and medical history. He did not offer a public statement. Standard classification placed him in a general population unit with restrictions appropriate to his sentence. The system absorbed him without comment, another file among many, though the path there had been long. The final administrative act involved updating national databases to reflect the conviction, closing loops that had remained open for years. Analysts confirmed that the genetic profile was now associated with a resolved case, preventing future investigative misdirection. The update was routine, but its significance lay in the completeness it represented. As years continued, the case receded from headlines. Anniversaries passed with minimal notice. Yet within records rooms and training manuals, the documentation remained accessible, a testament to methodical work carried across decades. The winter of 1994 no longer existed as an unanswered question, but as a documented sequence with an ending defined by law. For those who had followed the case since its beginning, the resolution brought a specific kind of quiet. It did not erase loss or restore time. It confirmed instead that careful work could bridge eras. Snow would continue to fall in Millbrook. Roads would be plowed and forgotten. Files would be opened and closed. One of them, at last, was complete. In professional circles, the case influenced how agencies approached seasonal disappearances. Analysts noted that winter conditions could mask movement while simultaneously preserving evidence, creating a paradox that required tailored response plans. Updated protocols recommended extended perimeter documentation and delayed scene disturbance when environmental preservation was likely. These recommendations were circulated through memos rather than press releases, reflecting a culture of quiet improvement. Archivists assigned to the State Records Center took particular care with the Caldwell materials. Paper susceptible to humidity was stabilized, and aging magnetic media was converted to secure digital formats. The work was invisible to the public but essential to institutional memory. Labels included both original and revised classifications, ensuring future reviewers could trace interpretive changes over time. The local press, having reported on the case intermittently for decades, published a final retrospective that emphasized chronology. The article avoided personal conjecture, instead listing dates, actions, and outcomes. It quoted no sources directly and included no commentary, an editorial decision intended to mirror the tone of the investigation itself. Readers responded with letters that spoke of relief rather than satisfaction. Clergy members who had officiated memorial services in the 1990s reflected privately on the conclusion. They described the burden families carried during unresolved loss and the different weight that came with answers, even difficult ones. Their reflections remained outside official records, part of the community's informal processing. Insurance and civil considerations were addressed quietly. Emily Caldwell's estate matters, long settled, required no revision. The absence of civil litigation underscored the family's focus on acknowledgement rather than compensation. Legal counsel confirmed that all statutory requirements had been met. Within the cold case unit, resources were redirected to other files. Detectives rotated assignments, carrying forward techniques refined during the Caldwell investigation. Mentorship emphasized patience and documentation discipline. The solved case became a reference in performance reviews, not as a benchmark of success, but as evidence of endurance. Winter continued to frame memory. Each December, snowfall altered familiar landscapes, echoing the conditions that once obscured answers. Residents noted the coincidence without assigning meaning. The town's rhythms persisted, shaped more by weather and work than by past headlines. Academic researchers studying wrongful convictions and cold case resolutions requested anonymized data from the prosecution. The material contributed to broader analyses of evidence longevity and jury interpretation of science. Findings were published in journals read by specialists, extending the case's influence beyond state borders. At the courthouse, clerks filed the last motions and stamped dates that marked finality. The docket entry was brief. No further action required. The simplicity contrasted with the volume of work behind it, a reminder that legal systems often conclude with understatement. As the years advanced, those who remembered the flyers and the searches aged into retirement. New residents arrived without knowledge of the events unless they sought it. The town did not memorialize the case physically. Its presence lived in archives and in the understanding that some winters carried unfinished business while others did not. The resolution allowed for a recalibration of trust. It demonstrated that institutions could revisit past failures without defensiveness, using new tools to test old assumptions. The outcome reinforced a principle valued by those who had lived long enough to see cycles repeat, that careful records and lawful persistence mattered. By the time another Christmas approached, the case no longer occupied daily thought. It remained accessible, resolved, and instructive. The snow would fall, the lights would glow, and the long silence that followed the discovery would finally rest, not as a mystery but as a concluded record. In the end, the measure of closure was administrative and human, reflected in completed forms and quieter hearts. The system moved on without forgetting, carrying forward a resolved file as proof that time did not erase responsibility. The winter that once held questions now held records, preserved with care and closed with intention. The town accepted the outcome with restraint, allowing history to settle into files, memories, and routine, where it would remain acknowledged but no longer unanswered. Time continued, seasons turned, and records stayed closed. As the final year of review concluded, the Maine judicial system issued its last procedural notice in the Caldwell case, confirming that no further motions were pending and that all statutory obligations had been satisfied. The document was brief, signed electronically, and entered into the docket without ceremony. It marked the end of a process that had stretched across calendars, administrations, and evolving standards of proof. yet resolved within the framework originally designed to carry such weight. The conclusion allowed agencies to step back and evaluate impact beyond the single conviction. Analysts compiled metrics on response time, evidence survival rates, and interdepartmental cooperation. The data revealed that cases from the early 1990s with preserved biological material had significantly higher resolution potential once modern methods were applied. Emily Caldwell's case became part of that dataset, its value measured not in publicity but in procedural insight. Within Millbrook, the courthouse resumed its ordinary rhythm. Snowmelt gave way to spring runoff, and the roads that once framed search efforts returned to their utilitarian role. The absence of ongoing legal activity created space for routine, an understated form of recovery. Residents no longer expected updates, and none were forthcoming. The story had reached its formal end. For the Caldwell family, time recalibrated slowly. They acknowledged the verdict privately, visiting no public site and requesting no recognition. Their daughter's name remained spoken within family circles, separate from the legal language that had finally named responsibility. Support services checked in periodically, then withdrew, following protocols designed to avoid reopening wounds unnecessarily. The state correctional system processed Thomas Andrew Harlan into long-term custody, updating records to reflect classification stability. Annual reviews assessed conduct and health, but the sentence parameters remained unchanged. The system treated the case as complete, shifting focus to management rather than adjudication. There were no incidents tied to public attention, and none anticipated. At the Records Center, archivists finalized long-term storage plans. Climate-controlled shelving held boxes labeled with dates spanning nearly 30 years. Digital backups were verified through checksum audits. The redundancy ensured that the documentation would outlast hardware cycles, preserving institutional memory for future reference. The work was technical and quiet, consistent with the case's final tone. Educational institutions continued to reference the case sparingly. Law enforcement academies included it in modules addressing delayed justice, emphasizing that patience and accuracy outweighed speed when evidence endured. Students were taught to respect limits while preparing for advancements yet to come. The lesson was framed as continuity rather than triumph. Seasonal anniversaries passed without observance. December returned with predictable regularity, bringing snow, shortened days, and familiar routines. The calendar no longer triggered official statements or media retrospectives. The community had absorbed the resolution into its broader history, allowing the present to proceed unencumbered. The local newspaper, after years of restrained coverage, archived its reporting online under a completed tag. Readers accessing the series encountered a chronological record devoid of speculation. The editorial choice reflected an understanding that closure did not require embellishment. The facts stood alone, sufficient and final. Policy discussions at the state level referenced the case in footnotes rather than speeches. Funding allocations for cold casework were adjusted modestly, justified through aggregate outcomes. The Caldwell case contributed to that calculus, one data point among many demonstrating return on investment through diligence rather than urgency. Private citizens who had volunteered in the original searches spoke occasionally among themselves, recalling cold nights and limited equipment. For them, the resolution validated effort without assigning outcome responsibility. Their role had been supportive, and the conclusion affirmed that collective participation mattered even when answers came much later. The legal community reflected on the appellate opinion, nodding its clarity and restraint. It reinforced standards for presenting scientific evidence without overstating certainty. Practitioners cited the ruling in continuing education seminars, reinforcing best practices for balancing innovation with caution. As years accumulated beyond the resolution, the case's presence diminished further. New residents encountered the town without knowledge of the events unless they sought local history. The absence of memorials or markers aligned with a collective preference for understated acknowledgement. Memory remained, but it did not dominate space. The final measure of closure emerged not through ceremony, but through normalization. The case no longer required explanation. It existed as a resolved file, accessible but dormant. Institutions moved forward, carrying lessons quietly integrated into routine. Winter continued to arrive each year, reshaping the landscape as it always had. Snow fell on the same roads, covering traces and revealing none. The season that once defined uncertainty now passed without incident. The narrative of loss, investigation, and resolution had settled into record where it belonged. In professional terms, the case demonstrated that time could be navigated rather than feared. Evidence, when respected, could bridge decades. Procedures, when followed, could withstand scrutiny long after their authors retired. The system functioned as intended, albeit slowly. For those who remembered the beginning, the end felt appropriately muted. There was no sense of victory, only completion. The law had spoken, and silence followed, not as absence, but as equilibrium restored. The Maine winter of 1994 remained part of history, contextualized and understood. Emily Caldwell's name persisted in records and memory, associated no longer with uncertainty, but with a resolved account. The community accepted this quietly, allowing the passage of time to carry the story forward without distortion. The final entry in the file bore a date, a signature, and a status code indicating closure. It required no further annotation. The work was done. The record remained. The season turned.